A Republican from Arkansas, who authored that controversial letter to Iran a few months ago regarding the negotiations. Senator, always a pleasure to have you on New Day. Thank you for taking this opportunity to test your ideas on this. Have you had a chance, a little bit of an unfair question, but have you had a chance to make it through the entire deal yet?
Yes, of course, Chris. I've reviewed the entire deal, and unfortunately, it's not as bad as I had feared. It's actually much worse. But first, the details, we have to remember who we're dealing with. Iran is an anti-American terror-sponsoring regime with the blood of hundreds of American soldiers on their hands. They cannot be trusted with nuclear weapons or even nuclear threshold capacity, but this deal puts them on the path to that, whether in the coming months and years if they violate the deal or even in 8 to 10 years if they keep the deal.
The pushback to that position will be, if you've gone through this deal in detail, which is impressive. Many of your colleagues have not yet, and we hope that they do as you have, as you say you have. This puts in a set of conditions and timing and restrictions that you had none of before this deal, and even under the sanctions, the Iranians had built up a pretty sizable stockpile of potential.
Well, Chris, we started these negotiations 2 years ago, in the president's own words, to stop Iran's enrichment capability. Iran has no right to enrich uranium, and as long as they have any enrichment capability, as long as they're testing new centrifuges, as long as they're conducting advanced research and development, then they are going to be mastering the process to develop nuclear weapons. And again, it doesn't really matter whether it happens next year, whether it happens 8 to 10 years from now. That is the blink of an eye in the lives of nations, and this is a massive gamble on the hope that Iran will change in 8 to 10 years. To give you a sense of how unlikely that is, 9 years ago, Iran was trying to kill me and my soldiers in Iraq. We were lucky, but hundreds of other American troops were not.
We understand, and we know well of your service, and you know, as I've said on the show before, we thank you for it, and certainly Iran's activities in what seems at best terrorism around the world is not part of this deal. That rankles a lot of people. Let's listen to the president, though, and hear why he says that the premise of these negotiations, which was, even in Israel's mind, to keep them from getting a nuclear weapon, was achieved.
We are measuring this deal, and was the original premise of this conversation, including by Prime Minister Netanyahu. Iran could not get a nuclear weapon. That was always the discussion. And what I'm going to be able to say, and I think we will be able to prove, is that this, by a wide margin, is the most definitive path by which Iran will not get a nuclear weapon.
Now, other than their right under the NPT, to which Iran is a signatory, to deal with enrichment of uranium in a peaceful way, the president says this was the best set of restraints on the table. What would have been a better alternative?
Well, the president said all along that no deal is better than a bad deal, and I think that this is a bad deal.
Why?
And he said at the beginning of these negotiations that the basic approach was to dismantle Iran's nuclear program in exchange for dismantling the sanctions. In fact, we're going to keep Iran's nuclear program in place. In fact, Western countries are going to help Iran in some ways develop advanced nuclear capabilities and secure those capabilities.
Well, how so, though, Senator? Let me stop you there, because if you read through the deal, you know that 2/3 of the centrifuges are going to be taken offline. 98% of the enriched uranium is going to be sent somewhere else. We're not exactly sure where yet, but so therefore the potential for them to enrich uranium to weapons grade is down, and their ability to have themselves checked exists in a way that it did not exist before. So how does it make it more likely, this deal, that they get a weapon?
So, Chris, let's just start, say, with enriching uranium in centrifuges. Iran is currently using mostly the most basic kind of centrifuges. Over the coming 8 to 10 years, they'll be able to conduct advanced research and development into extremely advanced fast-spinning centrifuges, which will help them master the process to enrich uranium. They don't necessarily need to develop the uranium stockpiles now. They could wait 8 to 10 years to develop it. Of course, they could do the same in a covert facility. Let's talk about protecting their capabilities. The text of the deal explicitly says that the West will Iran protect their nuclear capabilities from sabotage. That is a direct quote. Imagine the fact that we are going to be helping Iran develop their capabilities to protect what could be illicit facilities from the kind of sabotage that their nuclear facilities have faced in the past. I just think this is a very bad deal that's going to put Iran in...
Doesn't that language read not its illicit facilities, but that the Iranians wanted some type of assurance that in the name of inspection, the IAEA or others wouldn't go in there and actually sabotage their own equipment. And that's what that was. It wasn't about helping them create a bomb. What would you do to stop them from getting a bomb?
Well, first, I believe the American people will repudiate this deal, and Congress will therefore reject it. That will give us a stronger negotiating position and the opportunity to reimpose sanctions that will be tougher, the kind of sanctions that I and 400 members, including most Democrats, voted on 2 years ago in the House. And we will have to restore the credible threat of military force.
Oh, well, hold on one second. You just laid out two big ideas. Let's just take a look at them quickly, one by one. One, where do you get the support internationally for these kinds of crippling sanctions when you know that is eroding more and more all the time, that other big major players at that table want to do business with Iran? So where do you get that support?
Actually, Chris, that's not the case. The only place where sanctions was eroding in Washington, D.C.
No, India, China, Russia, they all want to do business, and some of them, we suspect, right, if we listen to our sources in government, we're starting to go around the backdoor way to doing business with Iran. So there are others who are very questionable about keeping the sanctions on.
Chris, we were the weakest link in these negotiations. The socialist government of France was driving the hardest line of all. These sanctions were not eroding until President Obama decided to lift them 2 years ago. We could, in fact, continue to enforce the sanctions. America has, by far, the world's strongest and biggest economy, and we have unique access to the world's international financial. Even China and Russia, in the end, though they might not have liked to go along with the sanctions, did in the early days of the sanctions regime, particularly after 2010 and 2011. They were beginning to work, but we let Iran up off the mat in 2013.
All right.
There's no reason with the political will that we couldn't reimpose those sanctions and the credible threat of military force.
So, okay, and that's the second point, the credible threat of military force. Especially coming from a veteran such as yourself who understands better than many of your colleagues the reality of war versus just the discussion of it as a tool, would you really be willing to use military force against Iran? And why do you think that that would lead us to a better place, given our history in Iraq and other places?
Well, Chris, not only would I be willing, the President has said all along that the threat of force had to stay on the table. Now, I don't know if Iran believed him, but just last week, the incoming chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff testified that the United States has the capability to destroy Iran's nuclear facilities. This would not appear what the war in Iraq looked like for most of the last decade. We're not talking about 100,000 heavy mechanized troops on the ground. We're talking about the kind of action that President Clinton took, for instance, in Iraq in 1998, over several days of bombing campaigns against Saddam Hussein's command and control facilities.
But Iran is a much better militarily equipped entity than Iraq was, as you well know. I don't mean to tell you your own business. You understand this very well, Senator. And it's not an easy target.
No, but Chris, just a couple months ago, President Obama himself said in almost mocking tones, we spend $600 billion a year on defense. Iran spends $30 billion a year on defense. We have the capability to utterly destroy Iran's nuclear facilities, their command and control facilities, their air defenses, and their coastal defenses. That is without question. The incoming chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff testified to that exact point just last week.
But whether you can do it and whether you should do it are two very different questions. Senator, thank you very much for taking a first step into this conversation with us. As the debate continues, please come back on New Day so we can give our audience the state of play.
Anytime. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Senator. Allison.